Welcome back to another episode of the Max Term Podcast. Kyle Stitch here alongside James Finch. And today we're going to basically look at what we would consider current events, signings that haven't happened and still are kind of interesting that they haven't. Mostly number one on that list for me is Jeremy Swayman, but we'll get more into some contracts that still remain out there. And I think we're going to start with this is a current event in that it's been recently talked about in a big setting. John Tavares' situation with the CRA and everything. We'll touch on that, and then we'll get into our contract signings and not signings, I guess we'll deem it as. So we appreciate you listening, tuning into Max Term Podcast, available on pretty much all major podcast platforms. Our content, including our contract projections for those that are signed or unsigned, are still available on X at AFP Analytics is where we post that content. Pin tweet, can't miss them. We do appreciate anyone who engages with this. For our listener who willed the Montreal Canadiens into making some moves so we could talk about them, we will get to the Montreal Canadiens this episode. So anyways, let's actually start quickly with the John Tavares situation with the Canada Revenue Agency, The Athletic. I'm going to say about a week and a half ago at this point. I've been working off and on this summer, so my days and weeks are kind of blending together. But I think it was about a week and a half ago, The Athletic. Very good, informative article on basically the John Tavares situation. So I've been hearing rumblings. So again, I work in athlete taxation. That's my day job. And my night job is hosting this esteemed podcast. So I've been hearing about this behind the scenes for a lot longer than before it kind of came out publicly. So what's basically going on is the CRA is trying to get about $7-8 million out of John Tavares, which includes almost $2 million of interest at this point. That's all in Canadian dollars, so it would be a little less in the US. But that's still a lot of money. Probably more money than either of us are going to make in our lifetime.
Don't say that.
Well, okay, we'll shoot for the stars here, and maybe we'll make as much as he owes in interest in our lifetime.
Yep.
So obviously it's not an insignificant amount of money, even for someone who is on an $80-90 million contract, close to $90 million, I believe. 11 and a half over 7 years. 11 over 7.
11 over 7.
$77 million.
Still a lot of money.
That's still a lot of money. So what basically is going on is there's been a long time tax treaty between the U.S. and Canada, and actually this exists between a lot of countries. It's just most common to talk about as it relates to athletics between U.S. and Canada, but in hockey it even applies to Sweden, Finland, the former USSR, even Russia, all of the countries that do that hockey players commonly will come from overseas to the U.S. or Canada to play. So this is not a unique U.S. Canadian issue. This would be a pretty standard thing for all hockey players. And basically it says that if you receive a signing bonus and you're a resident of one country and you receive the signing bonus in another, so in this case John Tavares had been playing with the Islanders, so he was claiming that he was a U.S. resident for tax purposes. So he received a signing bonus with the Toronto Maple Leafs based in Canada. So it was believed that should be by his team, his accountants, his agents, believe that he should only owe 15% tax on that up in Canada. And then in the U.S., he would take a tax credit for that amount, but he still needed to pay tax on that full signing bonus in the U.S., and because he was a resident of New York, that's been publicly acknowledged, so I'm not sharing anything confidential there. He also owed tax to New York State. So at the time, New York's tax rate would have been 8-ish%. We'll round some numbers. And the U.S. federal government, 37%. So we're talking about 45% tax. Combined Ontario and Canadian federal rate puts them about 55%-ish. Rounding some numbers here. So for you math whizzes out there, that's about a 10% difference. So in theory, his savings should have been about 10% by filing as a resident in the U.S. and New York versus up in Canada, about 10%. So 10% on how much was his signing bonus? I think like 16 million.
15.25.
So approximately $1.5 million difference. Again, not an insignificant amount of money. That's also coincidentally how much interest he kind of owes the CRA at this point. So again, we're talking, I know as an average listener, it sounds like it's hard to have sympathy for someone making $77 million. Keep in mind, after taxes, cut that in half. That's still a lot of money. That's still plenty for your lifetime. But it's still not an insignificant amount. And imagine sitting down and having to just write that size of a check.
Exactly. It's an unplanned expense, I guess you could call it. So even though it sounds like a lot of money to us, to the average person, it's a significant amount to all of a sudden have to give up.
And okay,
potentially.
And it's not like he has probably $2 to $8 million just sitting in his bank account. It's probably in some levels of investment. And if you sell investments, you have to pay tax on those gains as well. So it could have a ripple effect. So it's not full on like, oh, let's just cut this check, be done with, because probably has to make some liquid cash basically to be able to pay the check for the balance due first. And then, yeah. So it's going to have a level of ripple effect, which is where maybe ripping the Band-Aid off at the time could have been a smarter approach. I mean, again, no one wants to just voluntarily pay an extra $1.5 million in tax, and we always say we don't like to voluntarily offer up tax. But as I'll get to in probably a minute, that maybe there was that should have been the case, and then he would have saved basically his interest, which is the tax difference at this point. So the 15% signing bonus is not insignificant as it relates to contracts. So I think where this really comes into play is actually on entry-level contracts. So a lot of entry-level contracts come with a signing bonus. And a lot of entry-level contracts are given to, especially from European players, they're coming over to North America for the first time. So regardless if they're coming to the U.S. or Canada, 15% tax on a signing bonus for someone coming over probably is a very common occurrence. We deal with a lot of kind of U.S. citizens in our tax practice, not a ton of guys coming overseas. We deal with more players going to play overseas after playing like college hockey and stuff. But there would be a lot of kids, I'll say, coming over from, let's just say, Sweden to Canada and trying to get their signing bonus only taxed at 15%. They could actually save money by only taxing it at 15%. So that has a wide-ranging impact if the Canadian Revenue Agency basically says, yeah, that wasn't a signing bonus, you had to pay. So the issue is basically whether John Tavares would have to pay it back. And if he has to pay it back, the Canadian Revenue Agency is saying that it's part of salary. There is not a single signing bonus given out these days. I won't say a single. There's probably some that I don't know of, but it's going to be intensely scrutinized by pretty much the league if they have to pay back the money or not. So if they were to retire, they would owe the money back. No team is going to just let them keep the money if they sign the contract, get paid, and then say, "Nah, I'm good." So that's basically what's at issue. But you were only allowed to even take this provision, and this is where I think the discussion's not focusing enough with John Tavares. You're only allowed to take that provision if you're a U.S. tax resident for the year and not a Canadian tax resident. And this is where I think that there were maybe some mistakes made that now we're trying to cover up by disguising this as an attack on the 15% signing bonus clause in the treaty. To be a Canadian tax resident, if you have owned some property up in Canada, you potentially could be. But the big test is if you're up in the country for 183 days. For you math whizzes out there, that's about half the year. So July 1st, potentially, John Tavares started being up in Canada. Potentially. If you were to look at, and I did this math out, if you were to look at all the days the Islanders spent up in Canada, and then July 1st to the end of the year, taking out days that Toronto was actually down in the U.S., get about 160 days. So that would not quite put the 183-day threshold. But I also did a little research, and there were some articles out there. The Islanders season, if you remember at the time, they were not the best team. Did not make the playoffs. There were some articles out there that basically soon after the season ended, John Tavares went and started training in Canada. Went home to Canada, if you will, to start training. That right there probably is what's going to screw him in this case. And that's where I think the discussion should be focused more on is we, as the tax advisor, probably should proactively plan like, hey, if this is a possibility, you need to stay in New York a little bit longer while we figure this contract situation out. We need to make sure we keep you out of the country for 183 days. And trying to say you're not in or out of the country, I don't know how you're going to prove that.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to track that these days if you're the country. So
these days, going back.
Well, I just mean in the past, well, I guess 25 years, it's become even more of a, like, there's no way out of that.
No.
Essentially.
No.
Like, absolutely, you're not sneaking through.
No, John Tavares is not flying under the radar of both countries know when he's in and out of the country.
Yes.
And the fact that that's probably provable and probably true that he hit the 183-day threshold and he has ties in that year to Canada, more so than the U.S. He probably sold his house too soon. He probably should have kept his house the entire year. I'm guessing he put it on the market pretty quickly. He might have sold it pretty quickly. I'm speculating there, but he probably should have made sure he kept like his house in the U.S. and as many ties to the U.S. as possible. I'm assuming he had just as many ties to Canada for the year, plus the 183 days up there. That's a tiebreak. That's 100% a tiebreaker to bring him up there. And to me, that's the story. That's why I believe he's probably going to end up paying this bill. And again, going back to had we ripped the Band-Aid, had we acknowledged these facts at the time of filing, which probably should have been done, he would have paid what's now his interest owed. So if he did get assessed more tax in Canada, he could in theory take it as a credit down here. But that's also messy because the U.S. usually gives you 3 years to correct a return. We're a little past that 3 years, but the fact that it's through will be through a court order will probably allow him to maybe make some corrections down here. But That's just more red tape and more legal fees that he's going to pay. So that's my take on the John Tavares situation. I think that it was bad planning that is now being spun as an attack on the 15% clause, which I'm not saying is a non-issue, because it is an issue, and we are seeing Canada crack down on applying that 15% more. But I think that's being used to kind of hide the fact that there were probably some mistakes made in the planning and original filing of this return. So that's John Tavares. Now I'm going to not talk as much for a little while and turn the floor over. So let's get into, do you want to start with recent signings, or do you want to start with guys still unsigned?
I think we start with the recent signings. We'll kind of go with the past first and potential future signings second.
So hold on to your chairs. We'll finally talk about the Montreal Canadiens in a couple minutes. I don't think we'll start there, but we will get there soon.
Yep, it will happen. You'll have to get through some. I guess we'll start with the Sabres signing.
I think the Sabres had two since we basically last recorded. Less or so. Beck Malenstein, 2 years, $1.35 million per year, and then the bigger one, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, 5 years, just under 4.7 per year, if I'm remembering that off the top of my head. But I think that's where we start. So
he was 4.75,
just over 4.7. Yep. 5 years. So I think that's where we start. How did Buffalo do? Logic behind it.
Yeah, so I guess get the easier one out of the way. I guess that's the way we can look at it. Malenstein was a fourth line forward for the Capitals, and that's pretty much what we expected for him to get, which is fourth line money. So that was a pretty, I guess I don't want to say for sure it was an easy one to do, but it was most likely a pretty easy contract to get done.
Before we get to Luukkonen, I think it would be important to highlight why going to arbitration might not have been the best idea, though, in this situation.
For Luukkonen.
For Malenstein.
Why
the Sabres might not have wanted to take Malenstein to arbitration.
As long as this is what you're getting at, it's what's in my head. You acquire a player that you, I guess, obviously like because you traded a second-round pick for him. It's kind of hard to argue that he is potentially not worth a certain number. So when you go into arbitration, are you going to trash the player that you just paid a fairly good asset for? It's what you would have to do, but there's kind of some holes in the argument there because you willingly acquired them.
Yeah. And again, they, as you mentioned, a very good asset. So if I was the players' camp, I'd not only be looking at the stats of Malenstein's performance, but look at other players who might have been acquired for similar things and try to draw a comparison there. And I don't think the Sabres would have a very strong argument against that one.
Yeah, so that would have been tough. And that could have... The Sabres have a lot of money to work with, so I don't want to say it would put them in a bad spot. It would not have, but in general, good to get the deal done beforehand. Kind of sticking with arbitration and talking about that, UPL, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, could have gone to arbitration. A negative about taking a player to arbitration is you talk badly about him, which is not good. You don't necessarily want to create an uneasy relationship between yourself and the player, yourself being the team. So it's always good to avoid that when possible, which obviously they did. So a 5-year contract at 4.75. Our projection was 4 years, 4.7. So about right. He He signed for 1 extra year than we had, but right about the value we were expecting. And I think the big thing to look at, we put this in some tweets when we were reacting to the deal being signed. There were some higher end comps, Shesterkin and Demko. And then there were kind of some lower end, Philip Gustafsson with Minnesota, Tristan Jarry. Sorokin did end up in there. This is really a situation where we kind of expected him to fall in between. From a performance standpoint, he could argue pretty easily Shesterkin and Demko. But the issue is that performance was overall a smaller sample, where he's struggled initially in the NHL, had injury issues. So this really, really good performance in what I think we could say about the second half of this past season. Not a large sample size, so that's where you can kind of bring in those lower end comps of, well, maybe he should be paid a little more like this. So falling in between, let's say, Demko, who signed at about 6.13% of the cap, and then Gustafsson, who was 4.49%. Falling in between there and signing a deal for 5.4%, which is what he signed, that makes a lot of sense.
I think it's good work by the team to get that 5th year, because that is another unrestricted free agent year. So I would have thought, and I'm not disagreeing with the point that you're like, he's didn't put the Demko numbers out there long enough to get that contract. But if he had signed the same contract as Thatcher Demko, 5x5, that still would have fallen below Demko in percent of cap wise.
Yes.
To me, that would have been a fair contract to sign the exact same one, but percent of cap would be lower. So I would look at it as a slightly lesser deal for if you're going to give up that 5th year. But we're talking $250,000 too. So
yeah, that's true. And I think if it was the same exact deal, he would technically be below from a cap hit percentage standpoint. I still think the argument of being able to factor in those lower end comps ultimately would bring the AAV down a little bit more. So I'm not. I think he probably could have done a little bit better, but ultimately I don't see a huge issue with this deal. And I think it makes sense for the team to go long term here. 1, cap situation allows it. And 2, if he plays how he played, he's your starting goalie. And you do have a top goalie prospect in Devin Levi. But prospect, you don't know for sure what's happening there. So they locked in their starter. So that was kind of Buffalo's action in the past few weeks, were those 2 signings. Next contract that I think we definitely want to touch on would be the Philadelphia Flyers and Travis Konecny. 8 years, 8.75 cap hit. I want to toss out there that overall fan reaction was, that's a lot of money. That said, our projection was pretty close. So we had him projected at a 7-year contract at about 8.68. So let's call it 8.7. So just about there. He ended up re-signing or extending with his current team. He got the 8th year max term. Shout out to a good podcast.
Where you should subscribe on all major platforms.
Yes. So value-wise, it's kind of what we expected. Now, I will say when we project a contract, we're not necessarily endorsing it ourselves, saying we would absolutely sign the player to it. It's more of just us looking at the overall market and finding where a player fits in.
Yeah, and I think one thing that just has to be again reiterated is I think fans, observers got very used to the relatively flat cap in the NHL. Yeah. Because it's been basically since 2018, 2019, since there's been a more than a couple $1 million jump year to year. There's a $4 million jump this offseason, and there's probably going to be another $4, I think at least $4 next offseason, or for the next offseason, which is when he could have been a unrestricted free agent if this deal had not got done. So I think we do preach looking at the percent of cap. And when you look at the percent of cap, we're looking at he's falling well below both Philip Forsberg, Johnny Gaudreau, who were comps. This is not dissimilar to Taylor Hall signing that massive 1-year contract in Buffalo. So at least cap hit wise. So
yeah,
he signed that COVID year 2020, I believe, for that shortened season. So that was 3-4 years ago at this point. Konecny's cap hit is basically the same as Taylor Hall's $8 million cap hit back then. So we're talking almost $750,000, give or take a little bit here. But we're talking just because the cap has risen that much, that Konecny's deal has went up close to $1 million. Close, not full on, but that's kind of the expectation, kind of, I guess, the perspective that we have to start having. So it is a lot of money. It absolutely is. But in probably next offseason, couple off seasons, that's what good second line players even are going to be signing for. So I think when it's looked back on, the Konecny deal is probably going to be fine. I don't know if it's ever going to be like top value, but everyone's going to probably look at it as, that falls pretty much in line with where he's playing, where he's performing, where other guys are getting paid. That's kind of, I think, my takeaway from it. Like, yeah, I agree with you. I don't know if I have offered and signed up for it right away, especially with, I don't know. It's tough to go into the year without a contract, but I also don't like committing 8 years to someone pushing 30 years, closer to 30 than 20, basically. I don't know if I would have done it, but I think it's in line, and I think fans and observers are going to realize very shortly that we just need to change our mindset as it relates to the dollars given out.
Another example, quickly, that exact topic. So you mentioned Philip Forsberg as a comp. He signed an 8-year contract, and his cap hit was $8.5 million. And it's the contract he's on now. So Konecny's making more than Forsberg, or is going to be. This contract doesn't kick in yet, but he will be making more than Forsberg from a cap hit perspective. But when you look at the percentage, his is 9.51% compared to Forsberg's 10.3% at signing. So, and yet he's making $250K more per season. So that kind of shows the increase in the cap is going to, it's going to make players look like they're making way too much money, again, because everyone's used to a flat cap. Before moving on, Konecny did come in ahead, or I should say above, Van Riemsdyk and Okposo, which seemed right to us. Above those two, below Gaudreau and Forsberg, that about made sense. And then a player that is going to probably be impacted by this deal for his own extension negotiations out in Vancouver.
So we'll get there, and I actually thought of a second one as you were kind of saying that. So I think there's two that when you were basically finishing up these projections, the extension projections, there were 3 forwards I think that we were going back and forth how they should slot relative to each other. Konecny being one, Brock Besser, who you were alluding to, and then Carter Verhaeghe in Florida as well was another one right in that range. So Besser, I think Besser and Konecny fans would see more parallels too. They've had some really good seasons on their resumes, but there's also been maybe not the almost perceived $9 million value overall for them because their total point totals have been low. They've had some seasons where they've scored goals, but haven't consistently been at the top of the league in points, or at least I don't know if Konecny's has he had an 80-point season? I know he was coming off like a 73-point season, which is what fans were a little bit upset or questioning, I guess. But again, I think that's the level of where we're at. But
he hit 68 this past season. That's his top.
So not even a 70-point player.
Yeah.
And Besser hit 40 goals, but he also hasn't been the total point producer either. Verhaeghe's hit 40 goals.
Besser had 73 points.
I guess I was getting Besser and Konecny messed up in my head. So Besser was the one with 73, Konecny 68.
And Verhaeghe is kind of right at that same level. 72 points, 73 points the past 2 seasons. So I guess to expand on that a little further, we had all of these players projected at about 8.6, 8.7, which, again, all very similar. All will probably impact each other. We'll see what Verhaeghe ends up signing for in Florida, assuming he signs in Florida. And then Besser will be interesting, I think, because he's gone through a little bit more of a looking really good, and then his low was pretty low. So I wonder if he comes in a little lower than the other two because of that. But those are definitely 2 players to watch, especially after the Konecny deal. Moving on from
real quickly,
yeah.
just for like the Florida point. First, no state income tax.
Yes.
So that's going to allow potentially Verhaeghe to take a smaller contract and get paid and put the same or more money in his pocket. I also kind of think that if Verhaeghe had signed the deal that Konecny did, I don't think anyone questions that.
No.
Because
value-wise,
because perception, but on paper they're not that dissimilar of players, which is kind of the funny part. And I will also say, if you're thinking about the Konecny deal as it relates to another Florida player, Sam Reinhart, you're probably like, we just paid Konecny more than Sam Reinhart got. Sam Reinhart's contract, I think you need to throw it almost out as far as just logic as slotting other players in versus it. He fell in line with Florida's salary structure, and Verhaeghe's probably going to fall in that same line if he does get a contract done. So he'll probably end up $7.5 to $8 million. I'm just guessing based off of how kind of Florida's structure has worked. So if you're thinking Konecny got more than Reinhart, that's absolutely crazy. I think you just have to say Reinhart in Florida is just a situation that other teams just can't replicate. So it kind of can't come into your mind, and you have to look at it relative to other ones out there. Yep. So now I think that was kind of what I wanted to get at. So now we probably should continue to move along to other big contracts.
Yeah, well, couple smaller ones, I'll say. Columbus, Kent Johnson went short term, as well as Kirill Marchenko. Those deals are fine. Johnson hasn't quite shown the level of play as far as his draft pedigree would make you think, which is okay. But team going short term there, I think, is fine. Marchenko, I would have been a little more comfortable going long term. I think he seems like he's going to be a good goal scorer, but they go short term as well. They do have Patrick Laine there, who is taking up a large amount of cap space, which if he stays there, I think it's fine. Good goal scorer, but there are a lot of rumors around his name, so I guess that's something we could be looking at as we get further and further into the offseason here of him potentially being moved, which then there's some cap space there. Maybe it would have been good to go long term with these guys.
Laine also being kind of probably the easiest to acquire top 6 forward out there. So I think we have a couple of future episodes planned for diving in on specific teams, one of them being the Sabres. So that's why we didn't spend a ton of time on Luukkonen a little while ago. Might talk about the Laine as an idea there, because that's been a little bit of smoke. I don't know how legitimate, or just more like, hey, this could be an idea. But as far as top 6 forwards go, Laine's probably the most acquirable. So if Columbus does want to move him, it's probably doable. But as you said, maybe that should have meant they waited on giving one or two of these contracts to maybe get someone, probably Marchenko, as you said, wrapped up long term.
Yeah. One of those situations where there's not really a rush. Neither one of them were arbitration eligible. So I would have liked to see them let the Laine situation play out and then make a decision on what to do with the contracts of some younger players. Martin Necas was the next notable signing, we'll call it.
I think so we're using Puckpedia, been a very good resource since then. Puckpedia is going by when the team officially announced it. Brock Faber, I think, was also basically reported the same day as Konecny. We'll stick with Martin Necas, but I think Brock Faber was reported a little bit sooner. So if you're wondering, are we going to talk about him? Yes, we're getting there. We're kind of going in Puckpedia's order of signings. So Martin Necas, yes, let's go hit him next.
Interesting deal that sends him to UFA in 2 years. So a 2-year contract ended up being for $6.5 million a year, which is about the value I believe we had him at over 3 years. So that's not great. And then, again, they're walking him to UFA, which would make you think the AAV would be a bit lower, more in the team's favor, because they're kind of doing him a favor.
Yes, and we will get to Faber. Sorry, bad joke for everyone listening. But with walking, so our projection had him basically, again, at close to this cap hit, while also buying an unrestricted free agent year, which are generally more expensive. So the Hurricanes buying only restricted years, where they could have, in theory, went arbitration, or they could have went arbitration because the player had filed this year, and then the team could have asked for a 1-year deal, and then next year the team could have filed for arbitration, and the player, of course, would have asked for a 1-year contract. So that's a route that could have been explored.
I would also say with that route, which is what I would have preferred, you keep RFA status. So as far as potentially trading him, I think that leaves a little bit more value there than potentially trying to trade him to a team now and he'll eventually walk to UFA, which I guess a trade could involve some type of extension at some point. Not right now. They can't now. But it just, I don't know. This is the type of situation where I don't fully understand it from the team's perspective of why.
we got a little bit of pushback on like, well, a team could acquire him next offseason and still do extension. I mean, I kind of came around to that logic to an extent. Like, it's not wrong. I'm not disagreeing with your logic either. I think it's more, to me, the bigger issue is giving him $6.5 million for 2 years and not trying to, if you were basically, so they acknowledge they're okay either trading him in the next 2 years or losing him for nothing.
Yeah.
If they were okay with that scenario, I would have just played hardball and tried to keep his cap hit as low as possible for the next 2 years, because he doesn't have a lot of recourse unless he's going to go play overseas. And I mean, I guess that's a possibility, but I don't think he would have made as much as he's would have even gotten in arbitration. So we'll see what happens with the Seth Jarvis contract that Carolina still has out there. But if Necas, if they end up going short term with Jarvis because they don't kind of used up their cap space with Necas here, I question that the most from a cap management standpoint of not playing hardball, not going to arbitration, because Necas would not have gotten $6.5 million in arbitration.
So I think we were going to do signings and then players who still need to sign, but I think it would make some sense to talk about Jarvis right now. So they signed Necas to 6.5. They have about 6.4 in cap space right now. You mentioned the possibility of long-term versus short-term for Jarvis. Our long-term was 7 years at about 7.9. Our short-term was 3 years at 6.3. So our short-term projection would fit in perfectly. Now maybe he comes in a little bit lower. Maybe they don't go 3 years. Maybe they go 2, and it lowers the AV a little bit. But I think they can make it work. I think it could potentially wrap up their offseason, which ultimately for the team that needs top 6 scoring but was kind of willing to trade Necas as a player who believes he's a top 6 scorer, but if you're willing to trade him and it's your need, what is your belief in the player? You're walking him to UFA. What is your belief in the player? I don't know. So I almost cut to Jarvis there to say this deal I don't think fully impacts getting Jarvis done. I think it should rule out a long-term deal for Jarvis.
Yeah, if Jarvis signed and his agents sign up for a long-term deal to fit in Carolina's salary cap at this point, I think it's a disservice. So how much less could have Necas gotten? Like, could have Carolina gotten if they had played hardball? I can't imagine Necas coming in more than $5 million in arbitration case. I can't think of any recent.
I think he would.
I think just can't think of, and tell me I'm wrong, of any recent arbitration cases for forwards where the award was over $5 million. That I guess that's what I can't shake that. I also kind of we've been wrong kind of spitballing things. The other week we had referenced how many 5-year contracts were given to RFAs, and then I learned that Tampa had done that with both Stamkos and Victor Hedman. So we're wrong when we spitball sometimes, but I can't think of a forward, or like even Swayman last year in arbitration didn't get $5 million. I know it's not the same.
Yeah.
But like that's the top of the market goalie. So I don't know if it could have worked.
I suppose.
But I'm just speculating. Like that's kind of could have they gotten him $5 million or less to fit a Jarvis long-term extension. I think it's possible. I don't know, but I maybe.
Yeah, I don't think it's off base at all to question that. That's definitely fair. I will toss out there, I suppose there could still be some type of move that would allow them to go long-term with Jarvis. It's not like they're not allowed to trade anybody. But it definitely seems as though they've kind of, I guess, they've backed themselves into a corner and may have to go short-term. Hasn't been really any trade activity since the middle of July. Doesn't mean nothing can happen, but deals of players with larger cap hits at this point in the offseason are fairly rare. So it's very possible it's a short-term deal for Jarvis, and their roster is their roster.
I will say, so I mean, we kind of said that negatively. I also think Carolina did very well with the cap space and the deals that they had to get done. It would have been great for them to get Gensel back, and as you alluded to, they probably needed or still need another top 6 scoring player. I won't even say winger; I'll just say scoring player.
Yeah.
But given how many unrestricted free, we had done the math back before the offseason had started, and we were questioning how Carolina was going to accomplish all this. And I'd say they did well with what we thought could be the outcome. I think they beat my expectations with how they managed it. So even if they end up short term with Jarvis, I'm not giving them a bad off-season grade necessarily.
No, so they were one of the teams that did really well in free agency. The Will Carrier deal, long deal, but kept it at $2 million. Okay, from a standpoint of how does the cap hit fit in, that's great. Defensively, they lost Pesci and Shea. They brought in both Sean Walker and Shane Gostisbehere at a much lower rate than we were projecting for both of them. So good deals there. They got Chatfield locked in early before free agency. So they did a lot of good work. It's just now we're at the point of, okay, I guess I'll put it this way. At the beginning of the offseason, looking at Carolina, we probably would have put a Jarvis long-term extension towards the top of the to-do list. And we're at the very end. It appears the very end of the offseason for them, and they may not be able to do that.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it was a bad offseason, but not the most ideal situation.
But I would also say we kind of also were wondering, could they fit both Necas and Jarvis? I think we had kind of questioned that, and turns out they probably can. Without severely diminishing other spots on their roster.
True.
So I guess now we'll get to a favorite Faber to talk about.
Brock Faber.
Another
deal that was criticized, I would say, on X.
I don't know if criticized, but maybe more surprised. Maybe criticized.
Maybe I just saw some comments that you didn't.
Maybe that's also possible.
So from our perspective, so I guess to give full context here, 8 years, 8.5 is what Faber signed an extension for. So that's not this next season, but the following year. Coincidentally, when the Suter and Parise buyout cap hits significantly lower, they can fit in a big contract for their young right shot defenseman. So Faber was a fun one, I think, because we pretty much nailed the contract. So we had 7 years at $8,474,400. That's the raw number. So about 8.4, 8.5. I would round it to 8.5. And he signed 8 years at 8.5. This made a lot of sense from our perspective. Played top pair minutes, averaged just under 25 minutes a game. played pretty well. There were some periods of time where his play was not as strong, and I think that probably could be chalked up to he was a rookie and playing a large amount of minutes. From a contract perspective, 9.24% of the cap puts him kind of right in the Jake Sanderson, Owen Power, right in between those two, which I think there's arguments that could be made that right away that's a good deal for Minnesota to be signing Faber to, because one, Faber's already played about 25 minutes a game. Those two were not doing that. And he's also a right shot defenseman, which usually would have a little bit of a premium to it.
Yeah, and just like I kind of preached on Konecny, gotta adjust things here, and I think it gotta adjust the mindset, especially as it comes to young restricted free agent defensemen. The Owen Power and Jake Sanderson deals were to an extent record breakers in that they pushed things forward. They were like some of the largest contracts given to players that young. And we saw the forward market over the years start to explode, and top forwards started to get lots of money quicker, long-term contracts quicker. It hadn't trickled into the defensive market quite yet, and it is starting to do it now. So the other one still out there this offseason is Mo Seider,
which is, from really any way you want to look at it, it's a pretty good comp.
Yeah.
The two of those players, Faber and Seider. Play style.
Exactly.
Point production, how many minutes they're playing a night. They were both top, I guess, number one defensemen for their teams.
So Seider probably at this point gets, I wouldn't be shocked if he got a touch more, just to give him the token, we appreciate you, we value you more than this one. I'd also have said if Seider had signed first and then Faber, that Faber probably would have gotten the token slightly more. Like, I'm talking like Seider will probably get like 8.6 now, just to put him a little bit above Faber, because perception-wise, that's how agents and players look at things.
So what's interesting there is we had Seider 7 years at about 8.1. And the other interesting thing is Seider has much more of a sample size to look at for his career. Faber was a rookie, so you're basing it off one season. That will be an interesting one to see what happens. Faber signing first, I think, definitely helps Seider for sure bump up a little bit. If I was betting on it, Seider's beating our projection, 8.1. At this point, he's going to get over that.
Yeah. Although I will say, the only place it could come closer is if he only takes a 6-7 year contract and doesn't buy as many unrestricted free agent years. It could come down a little. I'm still think we're going to be low at this point, because I would not be shocked again if Seider got 8 by 8.6. That's me spitballing at this point.
I agree.
But yeah, we'll see what happens there. But yeah, I'm expecting we're probably going to be a little bit low.
Moving on, just really quick, we could maybe touch on Dustin Wolf signing for 2 years.
2 years, interesting. It seems like he's going to have an opportunity to take the net in Calgary this year. It's supposedly not a given, but if Calgary doesn't roll him out and give him an opportunity, I question what the Flames are doing. So the agent basically being willing to sign up for a 2-year contract seems odd, given Wolf should get ample opportunity to show that he can be a starter. I guess the reason you take 2 is if you're concerned that maybe he doesn't show up and doesn't get a bigger contract. But I don't know. I can't see a scenario where next offseason he would get much less than 850,000. So I don't know. I would have just preferred a 1-year contract here.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Not a whole lot else to say about that one. Just kind of a odd decision, I guess. Okay, so is it Montreal time?
Let's hit Ryan Lindgren quickly because the Rangers keep the listeners waiting for what they want. I want to hit Ryan Lindgren quickly because the Rangers are a team that we have a longer episode planned, probably in a couple weeks. I think we're leaning Sabres, then Rangers is kind of slightly deeper dives. But Lindgren, real quick, 1 year walks him to unrestricted free agency. Ranger fans seem very okay with that. $4.5 million fine. AAV is absolutely about where we expected. We'll get into the Rangers more. I think the idea of being okay with walking him to unrestricted free agency is not the mentality that I would take. I know he had a down year.
He's also hurt.
Exactly. He was also hurt. And the amount of turnover and contracts that are going to have to be done on that blue line in the next couple years, I wouldn't have voluntarily made Ryan Lindgren one of those contracts. Because he a long-term deal, just based on his numbers and his play style, a long-term deal was not going to come in significantly above a $4.5 million cap hit per year. You probably could have gotten 5x5. I'm just throwing something out there. Maybe I might be a little low there, but you probably could have went longer term and not paid a ton more. And now you're going to allow him to potentially talk to other teams next offseason. I don't know. I question that, but again, we'll get into the Rangers more.
we pretty much said 3 by 4.5 for him, which would have made some sense. But
Yep.
1 year, interesting decision. Again, another situation walking to UFA. We will get into that more, though, as we discuss the Rangers much more in depth at a later date. And you know what? It's not even Montreal time. I'm going to go with one more quickly. Jordan Spence with the Los Angeles Kings. This was one we missed a little bit on. So our projection for Spence on a short-term deal was 2 at about 2.3, 2 years at about 2.3 million AAV, and he signed 2 years at 1.5. Now, he was kind of an interesting player to look at because he had some pretty solid point production, but ultimately played very obvious bottom pair minutes, which is, if anyone hasn't really picked up on it, the amount of ice time a defenseman has is a pretty big impact on their contract. So he's going to have to potentially compete with like a Brant Clark for more playing time. We'll see. And he'll still be an RFA at the end of that deal. So
I think the one thing to just kind of tack on, we had discussed Spence a little bit, like where his projection should fall. We went to projecting him as if the team would pay him as if he would take that number 2, that second pair slot potentially, where they ended up paying him to be basically a third pair guy. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Yep.
But that was kind of the logic behind the projections, is we viewed him as maybe more of a 3-4 potential guy for the team and getting paid like that, whereas the team paid him more like a 5-6. So we were, I guess, speculating a little bit on future performance in this projection instead of just looking at past. The team stuck to their guns and basically kept him as a past, based on past performance. So now the main event that everyone's been waiting for, the Montreal Canadiens, Justin Barron, Arbor Xhekaj. I knew I was not going to get that right.
When we're not tuned into Montreal, like the diehard Montreal fan, so a name like that's going to throw us a little bit.
But I will say I probably watch more Montreal hockey than some of the other teams we've talked about, given they're out east at least.
Yep.
So those two deals, both solid contracts, both actually came in slightly below our projections. 2-year deals, I believe, for both of them. Both good, pretty good, promising players that bring something different to the table. Each of them do. Like, no problems there.
Yeah, I have no issues with those deals. Not a whole lot to even really say on it. Like, team did a good job. From what we were expecting for both, around $1.5 million. Barron came in 1.15 and Jack-Eye 1.3. So good work from the team. Short-term deals, so it's not, I guess, a huge impact, but they saved a little bit of money there. The big one, though, was not a restricted free agent this year. It was for a player who was going to be one next year. So a contract extension for Caden Gooley. Defenseman as well, a little bit higher of a tier than the other two. So Gooley, I think, is viewed as one of the core pieces probably in Montreal. Definitely top 4 defenseman for them right now, probably being viewed as a top 2. They went long-term with Caden Gooley, which we like to see. And we had some discussion with fans on X about that. Always good to go long-term coming off an entry level instead of short-term and end up having future earnings rise much more. Save some money here in the future. Projection was 6 years at about 5.2, and he ended up signing 6 years, 5.55.
Correct. Yes, I had trouble typing that one in when I typed it.
I'm looking at it, but I had to squint to really make out the letter or the numbers. Not a bad deal. Comp-wise, it puts him a little bit above Oscar Klefbom, Oli Mata, Brett Pesce a little more so. Comes in under Rasmus Ristolainen, which was an interesting comp. I think pretty much got there just from the point total, the time on ice, and at that age, it's just kind of the range he fell into. But ultimately, I think for him beating a Klefbom Mata deal at that age as a left shot defenseman is pretty good. I think he did a good job.
It's funny.
Or his agents did a good job.
It's funny though if you're a fan and you just heard us list off those names as the comps.
Not the right order.
Well, you're nervous. You're nervous about 3 of those players that like of him of the trajectory. So but we're not
2, I'd say.
I mean, yeah, Mata's fine.
Well, I would say Ristolainen and Mata worried.
Yeah, Klefbom
was an injury.
When healthy, yeah. But anyways, yeah, it's kind of joking. We're basing off past performance. Like this is not necessarily like we're not projecting out what his future performance is going to be. So the fact that those are the comps, it's more because they had perceived success early in their careers.
Yep.
At a young age, as you alluded to. So,
which I think, and you're pretty much saying it, but I think it'd be good to clearly state it at some point. There have been some fans of teams who will look at our comp list and say, well, they're not at all similar. And I think they sometimes look at the comps we have as what they became and not what they were perceived to be at the time they signed the contract, which is what we're looking at.
Exactly. So I love the approach Montreal's taken. I've been banging this drum for years. Any episode I can put it in. I did a presentation, big research, ran numbers, crunch numbers. Financially, in a rising cap situation, which is what we're again about to enter, a pretty significant rising cap situation. these long-term contracts now, in terms of basically net present value cap-wise, so to me, the logic should be to spend the least amount of money in today's dollars over the course of a player's contract, basically career. And the math just is so much in the favor of going long now, paying a slight premium up front to get a massive discount down the road. So I love that they did this with Guhle, but they're also doing it with Yuri Slafkovsky, did it with Cole Caulfield, did it with Nick Suzuki. Am I missing anyone? I think those are the big
That's
ones.
mainly the big ones. I saw some fans toss out Kirby Doc, and that wasn't quite.
I wouldn't draw the same comparison.
Yeah. That's not the same. So I think you had it. Guhle, and then Suzuki, Caulfield.
So there's been a little pushback. I'm like, well, this doesn't work for good teams. To me, the first team I point to is the Colorado Avalanche. They did this to like stunning success. They had McKinnon on a long-term great contract, Rantanen long-term great contract. They have Makar on a long-term very good contract. Sam Girard, I know he's not maybe all he was at one point, but he's also on a fine contract. Landeskog at a time was on a long-term great contract. Those guys were all given long-term contracts when they were young, and that allowed Colorado to supplement around them and ultimately build a juggernaut. I mean, then that's how it works. I also argue the Florida Panthers did this, I think, a little bit lesser of an extent, but you look at their core players, Barkov, Ekblad, and I'm missing someone. It's not Kachuk. It's maybe it's just Barkov and Ekblad at this point.
At the time, Huberdeau.
He had gotten a short term. He had gotten a bridge deal, but to an extent, Huberdeau as well. But Barkov and Ekblad in particular, going long with both of them, allowed Florida to build around them. It allowed them to spend the money on Sergei Bobrovsky.
Huberdeau was a 6-year.
He was a 6-year. Okay, so Huberdeau would be
6-year, $5.9
would
mil.
kind of fall into this as well.
So Florida, I think it's fair to say.
So, but it allowed them. I know the only two left are Barkov and Ekblad, and Barkov's on another contract. But again, it allowed them to bring in other pieces because they had some surplus value with basically their two franchise players. And so, maybe Florida didn't do it too as an extreme, but doing it, I think, saved them a lot of money. And then the kind of like to counter my own point, Tampa didn't do it as much. They were more happy to do bridge deals, like 3-year contracts for Kucherov and Point in particular. My pushback is, had they went long-term with both of those immediately, Sergachev as well, what type of cap hits could they have them on right now? And could they have kept their basically cup window wide open opposed to it's narrowed significantly? So I don't know. There's a lot of what ifs there, but
I want to toss out, just for the thought process, having examples, Quinn Hughes. After his entry level, so I guess I'll try and explain it this way. So year 2, or really his first full year, was 1920. Pretty solid season. His second full year was the 2021 year. Not as good. Kind of had a sophomore slump, pretty much. But that off season was when he needed a new contract. Vancouver did not go short term. They went long term. So they now have Quinn Hughes at 7.85. Well, the contract was a 7.85 AAV for 6 years. That started in the 21-22 season and ends in the 26-27 season. So for the next 3 years, Vancouver has a Norris Trophy caliber defenseman.
Winning defenseman.
Well, yeah, but continuing. He's still very young, very good. He's going to keep playing at that level for the next 3 years, $7.85 million. And when you looked at their situation this offseason, let's say he signed 2 or 3 years and they needed a new contract, you're easily looking 10 plus.
I was going to ballpark 12.
Yeah.
Above Rasmus Dahlin.
Yeah. So to have 7.85 as the cap hit for Quinn Hughes for the next 3 seasons after winning a Norris Trophy, that's amazing. That's a great example of why you should go long term.
That allowed them to add Jake DeBrusk, basically.
Yeah.
And another Hughes that the team did the same thing. Jack Hughes in New Jersey. New Jersey is another, so they haven't. We'll see what happens. So the Sabres, and Ottawa those 3 teams to an extent. I'd argue New Jersey and Buffalo a little bit more strongly have done this. We'll see what happens. But Ottawa's in that conversation as well. It hasn't fully come together yet, but I'm not fully ready to write them as failures either. New Jersey seems close. Buffalo and Ottawa still seem to maybe not quite be there. But if New Jersey has a really good year this year, like same premise, it allowed them to add Dougie Hamilton. It allowed them this offseason to add Brett Pesce to an extent. It allowed them to bring in Jacob Markstrom. Other players in there as well, but we'll see what happens. But I'm just I like what Montreal's done a lot, and I think there's trends that are pointing to that this is a very viable way to build a team.
Yep. And beneficial in the future when you're having cap issues as a good team.
So going along as usual in these off-season episodes, but we did hit a lot of the big unsigned names. I think I have 2 in my mind that we didn't hit on. Jeremy Swayman and the other Detroit restricted free agent. And I can't remember.
Lucas Raymond.
I can't I don't know why.
Cider done.
So we talked about Cider. So Detroit still has Raymond as well. And then Boston with Swayman. So Swayman and Raymond. Excellent too. We got there's some men to be signed, I guess we can say. So let's do Lucas Raymond first, in that we did talk about Cider. So at this point, say Cider comes in $8.6 million. I think that's a pretty fair assessment. So Detroit, in theory, I would think should have cap space because they haven't really done much this offseason to go long-term with both of them, but it's going to get tight very quickly, ironically.
17.65 is what Puckpedia has. Looking at our projections, and again, we acknowledged we might be a little bit low with Cider at 8.1, but we had 7 years 8.1 for Cider, and then 7 years 7.75 for Raymond. Cider probably gets an extra, we would think, at least $400K, kind of falling right around Faber. I like our projection for Raymond. Important to remember, he's 22, coming off an entry level. It's not comparable to Travis Konecny or someone of that similar age where you're buying up a lot more UFA years. But coming off a very strong season, 31 goals, 41 points. Our projection is built off more comps than this, but the 5 that we chose to throw into the document. Pasternak as a high comp. Keller just below. Kyle Connor just below. Philip Forsberg just below. Ehlers a little bit further below. So he'd stack up above all those players, but coming in just under Pasta. Seems pretty reasonable. And again, remembering the age, 22 years old, coming off entry level. We'll see, but it's not going to be. I think they can get it done. If it was 8.5 and 8, that's 16.5. And what did I say they have?
That would leave them about $1 million to bring in a depth piece or two.
Yeah, so
which they do need to do.
They can probably get this done. The biggest thing I wonder about, and we've brought it up in past episodes, is do they definitely go long term with both of these guys? Could a Seider go short term? Mainly because even though he's the number one franchise defenseman, the overall success and points haven't really been to that level. Well, Faber's deal kind of helps him out a little bit, but interesting situation. Two high-level players, both needing new deals. We think long-term fits, but like you said, it could get a little tight.
I would question the logic of, like, Detroit gave an asset up to get rid of Jake Wallman's contract. They've been pretty quiet in free agency, and one of their moves was to bring back Patrick Kane and give him bonus money, which allows them to keep this year's cap hit down to potentially apply. Like, they can either apply the cap hit, the bonus money cap hit at the end of the season. If for whatever he achieves, he'll achieve at least the 10 game threshold. I would imagine get an extra $1 million or 1.5 million, whatever that ridiculousness was. So they could either retroactively apply it to this season if they have enough space. But you think they give that bonus money to Kane so they can give themselves the option to push it to the next year, so they can go. So what I'm getting at is they've made moves along the way and then also been quiet in making additions to their roster to set up the ability to give both Seider and Raymond long-term contracts. If they did all of this and kind of cheap out, if you will, I question the logic, because I think they could have benefited from making additions elsewhere to improve their roster, because I'm not of the mindset that they've done enough. That's a different discussion, but I just I think they should have done more if they're going to end up giving one of them a short-term contract.
Yeah, I agree. I will toss out the possibility that maybe, let's stick with Seider, maybe he sees Faber coming in at 8.5, and that's kind of where the Red Wings are, and he's like, well, I've been playing top pair minutes for a few seasons. I should be a bit above that. Where's my 9.5? And then Detroit might be kind of uneasy about it, and maybe that leads Seider to say, okay, well, let's do short term, and potentially that happens. Still not a great overall situation of asset management, but I don't know, it's a possibility.
I'm usually the one to point out it takes two to tango, so I'm glad you did this time, because that's absolutely right. We're talking about, like, it's certain that long term should happen, but the player has to agree to that contract.
Exactly. From our perspective of what should a team do, they should be going long term, but yeah, two to tango.
I feel like we buried the lead a little. Jeremy Swayman, we're finishing with him. I'm borderline mystified that this is still not done, and obviously tomorrow, before we release this episode, it could be done. But no arbitration here. No contract yet. Allmark already moved out. And the fact that they went to arbitration last offseason, you wonder if there's some ill will there with Swayman's camp, and they're playing hardball, or I don't know. But the Bruins moving Allmark so fast and still not having a Swayman contract done, I guess I'm a little concerned for Boston.
Yeah, so this was an interesting one to project, because of ultimately sample size / usage. So he's a very, very good goalie. He's yet to be the number one because he was splitting time with Olmark. And from a games played perspective, that limited the comps where, like, sure, he could play to the level of a clear number one, but he wasn't necessarily, he just wasn't there from a games played perspective. So he fell more in line with a Demko, Shesterkin, Hellebuck, Gibson, their earlier deals, which kept his projection 5 years at about 6.4, which I think a lot of people, and I think they were in a way referencing different rumors and reports of, oh, could Swayman get 8x8, something along those lines, and maybe that's what Swayman wants, and that's the holdup here. Again, from just a sample size overall usage, 8x8 would be an outlier ultimately. Like I don't think there would really be a comp to point to that level of a contract for him. This projection 5 years would kind of set him up on a similar path that Hellebuck took, where good deal and then signs the much larger deal. Similar to Shesterkin, what we assume, shorter 4-year deal is what he signed, but now it's sounding like he could cash in on a much larger extension. So that's really where it seems Swayman fits in when you look at his overall career and profile. But like you mentioned, Olmark already being gone, that swings the leverage into Swayman's favor. Boston could be in a bad spot. I 100% agree with that because now he is their goalie. They have to pay him.
I think I'm just most confused with this situation that no arbitration was ever filed on either side, really, especially on Swayman's side. To me, that would have, I imagine he wouldn't have necessarily wanted to go through that again.
Yeah.
But that would have been his ability to put pressure on the team. Hey, maybe we could get a August blockbuster banger and get an offer sheet for Jeremy Swayman. Since there hasn't been arbitration filed, he can still sign one. That would be lots of fun. It's not going to happen, but that would be tremendous fun if someone wanted to come in with an offer sheet for Swayman. But I don't know. I'm surprised that Boston was willing to move Allmark when they did, and then haven't had a basically Swayman deal already done in the process.
Because you mentioned it, I had to go looking at like who could maybe to put pressure on the Bruins. So the Bruins have 8.6. An offer sheet, like if you actually want the chance at getting the player, would have to be above that 8.6. Because Boston's matching. They probably match above and then figure it out and trade someone. But in theory, so looking at teams with more cap space than the Bruins, Utah would be fun. They've got Connor Ingram, Karel Vejmelka. I don't think they would do it. Columbus, they need a goalie. I don't think Swayman does it. San Jose Sharks. Of the list of teams, that's the one that sticks out to me.
Utah sticks out to me, but
okay,
I could see Utah doing it because this. So to be clear, this would also, if we were to talk about a deal that would put Boston uncomfortable cap wise, and again, we're probably, it's not happening at this point,
no.
But we're talking
Just
multiple first round picks are going back, and I don't know if San Jose is in a position to do that. I think Utah would be slightly more in a position, but
yes. So where San Jose is interesting for me is They've got a lot of talent up front. Do they try and jumpstart the rebuild a little bit and bring in a franchise goaltender? I don't know. It's not happening. No one's doing it. Utah could. They'd be my number 2 on this list. So we went through Utah, Columbus, San Jose. Detroit's there. That's not happening with Detroit unless something is very wrong with Sider or Raymond. So I guess maybe it's not an offer sheet. Could it be a huge trade? Could it be Lucas Raymond for Jeremy Swayman? Which from hang on, just from a roster standpoint of team needs, it would make some sense. Boston would be without a goalie.
Yeah, they got Jonas Corpus. I can't even say that with a straight face. They have Jonas Corpusalo.
They could make it a little bit bigger of a
like
deal.
Alex Lyon.
Alex Lyon.
Ville Husso. And
Again,
Jonas
none of it. Like,
Corpusalo.
this is almost pointless. We're just having fun talking about this.
So thanks for listening, but
Detroit's not doing it. Calgary,
isn't doing it.
And even if they were, I don't think Swayman does that.
No, I mean, they got Devin Cooley.
Anaheim would actually be interesting.
And then they'd have John Gibson.
But
Jeremy
a team
Swayman,
really
and
needing a goalie in the
Lucas
Boston
Dostal.
Bruins would
Yes.
trade for John Gibson. It's not happening. But getting back to Swayman, it's odd that at this point nothing's done yet. And I really think, just looking at the overall situation, Swayman has all the leverage at this point and is probably pushing for that unprecedented, very high 8x8. Unprecedented along the lines of how much he's played.
Yeah. So that's I think about everyone we wanted to get to. We appreciate you sticking in this long. I know we teased all these, so you knew they were all coming, and we hit everything
Kinda
we
had to
promised.
talk about
Yeah,
them
so we
too.
had to talk about them. So we appreciate you listening. Max Stern Podcast available on pretty much all major podcast platforms. Next couple episodes, should subscribe to the podcast to know when they're going to be dropped. I think unless something shakes up the offseason, we're looking at the Buffalo, dive into the Buffalo Sabres, and then probably dive into the New York Rangers. Again, unless something else shakes up that we need to talk about between now and then. But we appreciate you listening, and give us a follow. X at AFP Analytics is where all our content can be found, and we'll talk to you next time.